Greetings and thank you everyone for being here this evening. I'm F. Clark Williams from the Dean of Students Office, which is coordinating this event in cooperation with the Jean and Alexander Hurd Library, the Curb Center for Art, Enterprise, and Public Policy, and the Barnes & Noble bookstore at Vanderbilt. If you were thinking that you would buy a book and have it signed, Michael will be signing after he says some things to us, but your opportunity to buy one here tonight is going to be over in about 4 minutes, but I think most everybody who wanted to buy one has done so. Thank you for doing that. I think most of you have discovered the restrooms, but if you go back out this door and to the right, and then just past the service desk to the right and down to the end of the hall when you're about to go into the elevator, they're on either side of the elevator. So give yourself plenty of time, and no, we'll not repeat it, Denny. You just have to pay attention the first time around. Thank you for that. We want to thank the Dean of the Library, Connie Dowell, for providing this terrific space, and to the library's Programs and Special Projects Coordinator, Nancy Dwyer, for providing the punch and cookies. The recent announcement of Dean Dowell's retirement stated that she has worked tirelessly to expand the library system's mission, to modernize its facilities and services, and to create a welcoming and engaging environment. And lo and behold, here we are, both welcomed and engaged. Before I forget, I'm going to break the fourth wall and just for a second to thank our colleagues from Vanderbilt IT and the library staff who are providing video capture for this event. So watch your language, Denny. And the support that makes the audio possible. It might be fun to try to lip read what Michael has to say, but I, for one, will be grateful not only for the video, but also for the soundtrack. So thanks to them. We want to thank our friends from Barnes & Noble at Vanderbilt who were here tonight making copies of the book available. The Barnes & Noble Vanderbilt is our bookstore, conveniently located in front of the SAE House on West End. They have the widest selection of Vandy gear anywhere on the planet. And yes, this is a commercial for the bookstore because if you were to rely on national media, you might conclude that the only thing keeping ignorance, illiteracy, and armies of darkness at bay from Nashville environs is a quaint little bookstore in Green Hills. Don't get me wrong. I love the local bookshop in Then There Are Hills. Michael Sims worked in such a bookshop at one time, but it's not the only resource in town for bibliophiles. And I got to tell you this story, and that's why I typed it out. I went out of my way to Green Hills to purchase a book written by the owner of that little bookstore, a rather well-known author. I searched the shelves, found a number of her titles, but not the one I was seeking. So out of curiosity, I wandered over to the Barnes & Noble at Vanderbilt to see whether the title might be stocked there, and I am happy to report that I was able to purchase a paperback copy of Bel Canto and get my Vanderbilt faculty staff discount in the bargain. Okay, so that's the end of the commercial. Introducing Michael Sims is Professor of English and the Director of the Curb Center for Art and Enterprise and Public Policy, Jay Clayton. I also want to say that recently he was presented the Harvey Branscombe Distinguished Professor Award, which is a big deal in these parts. Please welcome Jay Clayton.
Tonight we welcome to Vanderbilt one of our own. It's so great to have you back, Michael. And looking out over this group of people, some of whom I've just met in the last 30 minutes or so, I realize there's people that have known Michael a lot longer than I have and know him a lot better than I do. But I do want to claim my own share of relationship with Michael Sims. Did you come to Nashville in 1986? Did I hear that? 86, that's right. And worked at... Much the same age I am. Indeed, I was too when I came in 88. And he worked at Mills Bookshop, and then he worked right here in this library in the special collection. So he really is one of Nashville's own and one of Vanderbilt's own. We're really happy to have him back. I first met Michael through his wife, Laura Patterson, who was a PhD student in English here at Vanderbilt, and I was really proud to have served on her dissertation committee, which produced one of her opuses, and her most recent one, and Michael's as well. They collaborated on a young boy. So I got to know him then, and it wasn't long before I was reading some of his amazing works. The first book I read of his was Darwin's Orchestra. He had already written that before I think I met you. But Darwin's Orchestra is this terrific book of short essays, one for every day of the year and one extra for Leap Day. And it just covers this amazing range of topics from famous environmentalists like Rachel Carson and John Muir and popular culture figures. I'm a big Marvel comic fan, and so I love the chapter on Spider-Man, King Kong, etc. You know, who puts those together? Michael Sims does. He has edited a whole series of books on Victorian Dracula stories and crime stories. He's really interested in the kind of the late Victorian gaslight era and all the perversities that went on in the toward the end of the century, in the 19th century. And yet, at the same time, he's edited all these books on famous children's writers. You know, he's written a book on E.B. White and Charlotte's Web. How do those go together, Michael? Poorly, except I've been working on a theory. I'm an English professor. We have to make theories about these things. And I've decided that since the genre of children's literature was invented in the 19th century, it's a natural marriage, his interest in children's authors and 19th century Victorian criminality. But all along he was writing these wonderful books of natural history and science writing. And I think that that's indeed how Michael is best known in literary circles and in scientific circles as one of the most eloquent writers on science working today. Adam's Navel, A Natural and Cultural History of the Human Form, is a kind of atlas of the human form with chapters on various organs of the body. Another inspired way to put together a book of natural history. He's written Apollo's Fire, about kind of a biography of the sun during a typical day from the rising to the setting of the sun. And a book called In the Womb, which was an accompaniment to a National Geographic television series. Today, as you know from all the publicity that's been around this reading, he'll be telling us about his new book on Henry Thoreau, and I will let Michael do that himself. Please welcome Michael Sims.
First, I'd like to thank F. Clark, and then I'd like to ask him to tell me where he put my notebook. We begin with that lovely professional moment, I think. And one of the connections, by the way, that I'd never thought of before between the genre fiction stuff and the Victorian era criminality, the children's books and all that, is the similarity that I've learned about in the last year with our son, the similarity between children and criminals. Amorality, restlessness with laws or restrictions of any kind, insatiable appetite for whatever's right in front of them. Okay, I have just the last little bit of laryngitis going away, so my voice may go high or low at any moment. Just consider it part of the entertainment. First thing.
I'm just going to make sure your mic is on. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Let's see.
We could turn me up and then we could start all over without the lost.
No, you're fine.
I love taped radio interviews because you're going along and you stumble and you swear with some good, strong, short Anglo-Saxon word, and they go, okay, let's go right back to that last question. Okay, are we good? Okay, first thank you to Jay for that wonderful, generous introduction, which I will try and fail to live up to. And thank you to F. Clark Williams for putting so much of this together and keeping me on track and nudging me and saying, now you remember what day it is, right? And it was the building you used to work in and you can find it and all that sort of stuff. Also, I have to say that this is very much old home week for me to be in this building because, as Jay mentioned, I worked in special collections. I began in 1991 and left in 95. I left when I got a notice that my agent had sold my first book. I left roughly 21 minutes later. I said, this is notice, I'm out of here. And then I was in here a lot using the library to research that book, and Denny Adcock and I had shared an office in special collections. And he did the photography for that book. And then John Erickson and I were friends at that time when I worked in the library, but we became better friends after I left the library, which is a common theme in my life, that when you're not with me every day, you're able to put up with me longer, I think, is how it works out. I want to begin talking about Henry David Thoreau by quoting Ralph Waldo Emerson, which seems appropriate. He said of Henry, he was free and strange. Henry was very, very strange. And I want to say up front, however, that a joke that a friend of mine kept making is not true. He did not go to Walden because his brother said, please go live alone by yourself, you weird wanker. That is, nothing like that happened as far as I can tell. But many people have responded to Thoreau in a way that they feel, a lot of academics and a lot of others too, general readers of Walden, that they come down on one side or the other, pro or con. That you become a worshipful acolyte and he is the patron saint of environmentalism and civil disobedience and everything else. Or you declare him a mountebank and, as P.J. O'Rourke called him, a sanctimonious beatnik, which even if it's P.J. O'Rourke is a great line. That you need to come down on one side or the other. And my view is, why? It's the paradoxes that made him so exciting to write about. It was at times as if I was trying to wrestle 5 different gorillas into one little cage. But I did it. You know, several of you are holding the cage in your hand. He almost seems to have multiple personality disorder, even if you're just reading through Walden, because there'll be screeds and rants and life-changing activism and philosophy. And some of the most lyrical, accurately perceived observation of nature that anyone ever did. And Hemingway had the line that everybody is familiar with, that most of American fiction traces back to Huckleberry Finn. And I think a huge amount of American nonfiction traces back to Walden, because so many, many things traveled this way toward Walden, it almost seems, in the 19th century, and then it becomes the bridge you cross. You can't not read Walden. You can't not respond to Walden. And so I encountered him in high school, which is exactly when you need him, and I was already interested in nature writing. And I'm going to quote only one line from him. I do not like the idea that one single dorm room poster could sum up your life. But there's one line of his that keeps coming back to me in all kinds of situations. It's something very close to, and I should have just written it down. I consider how much of what I will call, I consider the cost of a thing, how much of what I will call life that has to be exchanged for it, immediately or in the long run. And it applies to, what does it cost you to stay emotionally immature? What's the cost down the road? It costs too much. You should probably go to therapy. You know, so many other things like this. What is the real cost of the car you want if you, in terms of time and pieces of your life? All those many, many things. And so that led to my idea that the first rule of trying to make it as a writer was to keep my bills really, really small. That I didn't own very much. I didn't want very much. There was nothing else I wanted as much as I wanted time to write. And that came from Thoreau. And a second thing I want to mention is that his name. His friends, he himself and the family, and all pronounced it Thoreau. And so he was born David Henry Thoreau. And sometimes it's like Thor, T-H-O-R, the god, and sometimes it's more like Thoreau, like you did a thorough job. And a lot of his friends would send letters and notes to him with little punning things like, what a thorough talk you gave, and stuff like that. There's all kinds of evidence, and including what people called him phonetically in their diaries, such as Hawthorne, before he learned how to spell his name. However, who among us is going to change anything we think about or how we say his name because of that? We all grew up saying Thoreau. As soon as his family died out, everybody was saying that. And it originally was Thoreau because his family was from Jersey, the French-dominated island in the Channel. So if someone discovered tomorrow that Ernest Hemingway pronounced his name Hemingway, I wouldn't switch to that. So I don't think it matters. And my agent will call and start talking to me, and she'll try to switch over to Thoreau. And because this book is very close up and personal in his life, begins in his childhood, stays very close to him, and I wanted it to be, as I say in the intro, I wasn't interested in just sort of polishing the marble bust of the icon called Thoreau. I wanted to, see I did it right there, I wanted to follow Henry. And so throughout the book I just call him Henry up close. And so I'm going to tend to default to that, in part because then you won't be listening to how I pronounce his surname. And one of the things that makes him so poignant and interesting to me to write about is all those paradoxes in his personality and character. It makes him three-dimensional. He could be very sweet and generous, devoted to his family, adored his mother, worshipped his older brother, and emulated him in so many ways. He could be very prickly, thistle and vinegars to all sorts of people. And a lot of people said, I love him, but I don't like him, or I would just as soon hug a tree as hug Henry. And one of the reasons for that seems to be summed up in something Temple Grandin said about him. In one of her roll calls of prominent and influential and successful autistics, she always lists Thoreau. And there's an awful lot of anecdotal evidence, and people have written various serious articles about it, and I don't analyze in the book, I'm just telling the stories. All of the analysis and research is in the back, off stage, and in notes and source notes and bibliography. So I don't do that, I describe it. And so I searched every single remark I could find that anyone said about him when he was in college or a child or as a young adult. And there were things like he would often walk like this at Harvard with his hands clutched down his sides, walking like this with his eyes on the ground. He would very often look off to the side. He admitted he almost never looked anyone in the eye. And he would look off to the side and talk in a steady monologue, in a monotone. And he would become an encyclopedia about anything that interested him and completely dismissive and scornful of anything that didn't. Lots and lots of other things like this. His ability to intensely focus on something and completely ignore everything around him. And he made of his life a manifesto of iconoclasm, but as I think is so often the case, he was creating a framework and rationale in part for how he simply naturally was. He was smart enough, and he was intelligent enough and enough of a gadfly and social critic, I think, to formulate a philosophy around what was, in a sense, his own natural bent. And I think that's true of some of philosophers, and, you know, Schopenhauer wouldn't have quite as depressing a philosophy if he had been a happier man, surely. And so I think that applies to Henry. And so I keep coming back to the ways in which Henry was so much like us. And I wanted to write about him in those early days when he was a yearning, questing, confused, intellectually and emotionally hungry nobody, before he amounted to anything, before anyone knew who they were. Because what I keep coming back to about these people, and I think in some biographies we lose sight of that, they didn't know if they would amount to anything. Emerson was 34 when he met Henry. Henry was 20. Well, they had met a little bit, but when they really became friends. In The Night Thoreau Spent in Jail, the play, a lot of times he's presented as this sage old man, as if Aristotle has become Henry's mentor, when really his mentor was 14 years older. And so there are a lot of ways in which they were young, searching, they weren't known at all. And they really did, they had the same thing we have right here today. They didn't even know if they would live till tomorrow. And I think a whole lot of biographers lose sight of that. Biographies have to move from significant contribution to significant contribution, and of course they do, but sometimes there's a little period where like a chapter or two feels like a trudge. The biographer is thinking, oh, I've got to list this because if I don't deal with this, I'll be in trouble. Somebody will jump on me. And so therefore you get 500 or 600 pages of everything. There's not time to slow down, zoom in, and give the texture. So I started reading Henry Thoreau biographies in reverse order of publication. And the farther back I got, the less black and white it felt, and the more full color it felt. And then I stopped reading the biographies about 1920-something and started I started over at the other end with the primary sources from his life. And so that was part of the excitement for me, was things like he and his brother taught a school, a very progressive private school. And they had recesses. They had no capital punishment, no corporal. They did not kill any students. No matter what they did, no corporal punishment. And some of the writing exercises could be that if you were boarding at his parents' boarding house and you were going to their school, then you could spend your writing time writing letters home about what was going on that week, and that would be critiqued as your writing exercise. What that translates to for me is I have fresh dialogue and incredible details from the point of view of a 10-year-old written down 1 hour after it happened. So tons and tons of things like that just began to make the hair stand up on the back of my neck, which is happening right now again, so I'm clearly in the right job. And so I was working on the proposal for a different book. It was going to be about Kenneth Graham and the writing of The Wind in the Willows, despite Laura's concern that only 9 people in America know what The Wind in the Willows is, which is one of my favorite books. But I pick up Sophia Peabody Hawthorne's diaries. And she describes a wonderful scene that has absolutely no historical significance of any kind, no literary significance. There's nothing important happened. But I'm going to read to you a page from my book that describes that scene. And it's the finished version of how it appears in the book, but it was the passing reference to it in Sophia Hawthorne's diary that made me decide I had to write a book about Thoreau. The winter of 1842-43 was a cold, difficult time in Concord, with the thermometer sinking to its lowest point in recent memory. Despite their hard work, the Hawthornes raced into winter like children. The first snowstorm found them in Sleepy Hollow just east of the square, where cut stalks of the summer's field of Indian corn lay buried under snow. The newlyweds slid down hills together, their laughter echoing from the pyramidal chestnut trees and the knotted arms of the oaks that surrounded the hollow on all sides. The Concord's slow current froze quickly in winter, after flooding lowlands for miles, thus providing wide, clean surfaces for skating. Ice skating was as popular in winter as sleighing. At times, both river and pond were covered with laughing skaters, and the fields musical with the jingling bells of horse-drawn sleighs. In December, at the bottom of the Hawthorne's orchard, the often flooded meadow transformed into an Arctic sea. After a day in which Hawthorne wrote while Sophia sewed or painted or read, they would spend a cozy hour together in his study before dressing warmly and venturing out to cavort through sunset and into twilight. Hawthorne skated in a way that his adoring wife thought majestic, as if he lost his terrestrial shyness and acquired heroic grace. Wrapped in his fluttering dark coat, he cut nimble, sweeping curves away from her across the ice, only to glide back on whispering skates and circle her and dart away again. Sophia herself liked to run and slide on the ice instead of skating. Often they saw other skaters, always boys or young men, never women. Few women skated. When Dr. Josiah Bartlett's wife's sister, Sarah Alden Bradford, visiting Concord in the early 1820s, she impressed the locals by skating with energy and grace. But Concord women were slow to follow her daring example, at least publicly. One afternoon, Henry and Emerson joined Hawthorne for a skating party. Sophia watched from the window as they paraded by on the river. At home on the ice from countless forays since childhood, Henry led the way with an energy and abandon that Sophia found both impressive and ungainly. As if suddenly ecstatic, he cavorted in what she soon described to a friend as dithyrambic dances and Bacchic leaps. Second in line was Hawthorne, gliding across the surface with his usual solemn grace, appearing to Sophia's eyes like a Greek statue propelling itself. Then came Emerson, seeming half asleep, tilting forward at the waist until his top half was horizontal, as if he napped by reclining on the air itself. Soon, exhausted, Emerson came indoors to rest, joining Sophia by the window. He said that her husband reminded him of a tiger or a satyr whose energy might be the death of an ordinary mortal such as himself. He beamed a kind smile at her. "Mr. Hawthorne is such an Ajax. Who can cope with him?" Thus began my research for what turned into the adventures of Henry Thoreau. completely pointless sort of moment, but all three were alive in ways that they had not been sometimes in, I felt, whole books I had read about them. And these are, I'm not saying these are moments that no biographer ever mentions or anything like that. It just hadn't been opened up the way it was in the primary sources, and that's what I kept wanting to go back and do. And Henry led a very busy life. I mean, he was not a hermit, as I'm sure you know. He spent only 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days at Walden Pond, and he famously walked into the village 1 mile away, almost every single day. He said he liked homeopathic doses of gossip. And I love that line, and that he found it in a way as refreshing as the peeping of spring frogs. There's famously, Rebecca Solnit wrote an essay recently in which she's quoting from a lot of emails she and I exchanged about Henry Thoreau, and she said people are always saying, he's just a phony, his mother did his laundry. Well, there's no doubt that his mother and sisters showed up at the cabin with cakes and cookies and everything else, and he was also at their house, which he had helped build, every single day or two, doing something around the house, working on it. And he kept careful financial and spiritual accounts of life. The spiritual accounts became Walden. The financial accounts are what he owed the family if he borrowed something or paid something, because he continued to be the tenant after he left Walden. Other than his brief time with Emerson on two occasions, he continued to live with his family his whole life, and he paid them rent, and so it balances out far better than the pro and con crowd sometimes seems to think. And because of all these things, I became obsessed with Henry's personality, and I kept wanting to, I think, celebrate the paradoxes and describe all these things with just no value judgment on them at all. That he was difficult. He was unquestionably difficult. He kind and generous one minute and a prickly jerk the next. And incredibly opinionated, and very much not maybe deliberately trying to be different from everyone else, but rather proud of such terms as the village atheist, the village freak, those kinds of things. He just sort of smiled and went his own way. And until and this occurs during the time I read about, he accidentally sets 300 acres of woods, the Walden woods on fire and burns 300 acres. He and a young friend were boating, and Henry, contrary to the myths, loved new technology of any kind. And finally, thank God, they had the lucifer match. And so he decided they would take lucifer matches with them on the camping trip to start the campfire. Then, because he's Henry, he tells everyone he's going to do this, because implying he's very progressive, and then he forgets to take them. So they stop at different houses until they find someone who can lend them a match. They then stop on a dry bank where there had been a drought, and they take a stump and they build a campfire, and it ultimately burns 300 acres. If he hadn't been out with the son of the most prominent, Judge Samuel Hoare, the most prominent Concordian, he would unquestionably have gone to jail, because it was thousands and thousands of dollars worth of damage. And so everybody yelled at him and called him a woods burner and a radical and a damned snake and all those things. And so this occurred at such a time that, although he doesn't analyze it in this way, you can see him immediately afterward stepping up his search for a place to have a cabin. And so I follow all this and try to just do it in story form and not look ahead, not play prophet and look ahead at how anything turns out. And that, to me, returns something that I miss sometimes in biographies. It returns the thing that keeps all of us getting up every morning: suspense. If you don't already know Henry Thoreau, you have no idea what's going to happen on the next page, unless I start forecasting it all for you the way a lot of biographers do. And so I just don't do any of that. I don't at any point ever look forward. And my book ends halfway through the time at Walden, because I kept thinking that there was an absolutely perfect moment I wanted to use. And I said to Laura, my wife, that Jay knew that we were talking about. Well, half of you know Laura anyway, probably. I said, I'm really frustrated with having to write the entire Walden account when I have this incredibly good moment. And she said, "Why are you a freelance writer again?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Can't you do it any way you want to? You just make it work." And so I did. And so I ended it in a way that ends on a beautiful crescendo when there's a terrible spiritual breakdown almost on a mountaintop in Maine, followed by his scurrying home to safe, tame Walden, and thinking about what it means to him in that way. And to me, the moment that Emerson begins to be disappointed with Thoreau is when he becomes more focused on the actual animal in front of him. He becomes more interested in the scientific, natural history sort of way and everything that's going on around him. And he begins to keep careful records. And Emerson gets to be disappointed with him at that point because nature is no longer symbolic for Henry in the same way. But Henry, his attitude is basically, I would prefer a real woodchuck to a symbolic woodchuck. And so he begins at that time to do those things like keep very, very careful records of when every plant blooms in the whole region. Such careful records that a bunch of different climate scientists right now are using his journal to study how much the climate change has affected, and it's 2.3 degrees, that the temperature is coming up 2.3 degrees warmer now than then at the same times of the year, that the plants are opening earlier and earlier in relation to that. So I just found all of that so interesting. And I just want to mention one thing, is that I noticed in the early 20th century biographies, Henry had been dead a while, and they begin, by the turn of the century, taking the women out of the picture a lot. And his mother and sisters were founding members of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society, and they were fierce, vocal, going to conferences in Boston and elsewhere. They called them going outers at that time, if you were really going out in favor of something. And so the women were the movers and shakers, and across America they were pretty much leading the abolition movement at that time. And Lydian Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson's wife, was the motivating force that got him on board for abolition, because he kept going, I don't want to get on the bandwagon, and also I really suspect they're not as bright as we are. I mean, a whole lot of unsavory but also interesting, weird things. And Lydian is the person who kept pushing him. And so on that note, I want to mention one little thing about the play The Night Thoreau Spent in Jail. What I find so frustrating about it is that Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee back in 1970, they clearly did their research, and then they played very fast and loose with it. They deliberately misrepresent Emerson in all kinds of ways. But the main thing that they do that bothers me is they take the women out of the story. All the important things that Lydian said to Ralph Waldo, they take all those words out of her mouth and put them in Henry's. Henry's two sisters, who were very bright and wrote letters to him in Latin, they both taught, very bright. They're completely excised from the story. Ellen Sewell, I have two chapters that deal with his romance with a young girl named Ellen Sewell, a young woman of 17, and how they're doing things like in the height of the phrenology craze, where they thought the bumps on the head would tell your fated character. There's a wonderful scene written down by 2 or 3 eyewitnesses and participants of Henry David Thoreau, the wild man of the woods, standing there at the age of about 27, running his fingers through the legendarily beautiful hair of 17-year-old Ellen Sewell and trying to find a bump on her head that would tell him something about her character. And those are the kinds of moments that I kept coming back to. And I kept asking myself, what did it sound like on a Concord street at night? And the second question was, what did the cabin smell like? Because I felt no one had ever mentioned that. I was able to find 2 or 3 comments on what it smelled like. So that was, to me, part of the fun. So when I think about how the women have been removed from the Thoreau story, I just keep thinking about people who say that we don't need feminism anymore. And it just sort of makes you want to whack them with a large Norman Mailer novel. And so in Henry's life, it was really fun to restore the women to the picture in a complete broad across the whole map. One last thing, and I want to close with reading just a couple more paragraphs from the book. As you all know, the 19th century was a time of just incredibly rampant illness. Medicine could do basically nothing for a wound or infection, and that's kind of broad, but overall. And the Boston area was the epicenter on the continent for tuberculosis, and it eventually took Henry's father and sister, his uncle, and Henry himself. And so your only defense really was a hardy constitution. And so the more I wrote about this, the more I realized 3 or 4 important people had to die in the course of this book. And there's one, I don't go all the way through to Henry's death, but in the epilogue I do. And in fact, he had about 14 years left after he 16 years after he left, where my book ends. And that's the flowering of the Henry who became the famous Thoreau. And by the way, when I told I was writing this, Laura had put up with 2 years of my talking about Henry. And when I was kind of sad that I had ended it in the epilogue and Henry was dead, I go upstairs from my basement office and I say, I had to kill off Henry. And Laura, who's famously kind and sweet, started going like this, ding dong, Henry's dead, Henry's dead. So that's the negative side effects of tormenting people with the book for that long. But in this, during this time, my mother had a severe stroke and died. Laura became pregnant and in that same month. And so there was her pregnancy and the birth of our son Vance. And so I was thinking very much about the full circle of life. Mom's train and Vance's just missed each other. She never met him. And so I was covering the deaths of various people in this book and how subject they were, in a sense, to the whims of fate, that anything, I mean, they just didn't have what we all take for granted as medicine. And medicine now is not a miracle worker for so many people. But you can go around with a list of things you could have died from when you were 11. And they were doing that. But something that struck me as really interesting and a beautiful moment is another thing in the story of Thoreau and Emerson that is not of really historical significance, and it's not a great literary moment, but it's a great human moment. And it is that at this time, when so many great inventions were happening that created our modern era, such as the telegraph, for the first time in the history of humanity, there was instantaneous communication. Trains, for the first time, there was rapid movement across land without animals involved. So many changes, and medicinal changes of various kinds. But there was also photography. It was the first time in history that you really could clearly remember someone after they were gone. So I want to end this with there's first a spoiler alert. A minor character in the book dies, but I'm going to read this section, so you're going to know he dies, but you won't have known him very well, don't worry. It won't break your heart. 2 of the other deaths will, I promise. I killed myself to make sure they would break your heart. It is Ralph Waldo Emerson's 5-year-old son, Waldo. And I want to read 2 paragraphs to close with that in the aftermath of Waldo's death. But the Emersons was the first generation to possess a new kind of memento after the death of a loved one, a daguerreotype. This brilliant new invention, which had been announced as recently as 1839 at a meeting in the Academy of Sciences in Paris, was already being touted as a miraculous machine to preserve time. Originally, exposures had taken hours or even days, but over the last couple of years, the process had been improved. A positive image, reversed as if in a mirror, was produced directly on a silver iodide-coated copper plate. The result so sensitive to smudging that it had to be isolated under glass, inside a frame or in a folding case. Daguerreotype portraits still required excruciatingly slow exposures. Children posing for a photograph had to be coaxed into premature solemnity. The previous autumn, other friends and family members had been unable to talk the restless Waldo into sitting still long enough for the slow, boxy camera to capture his image. Only John had prevailed. At his behest that day at the photography studio, Waldo, dressed in a girlish smock with a light ruffled collar, had sat in a wooden armchair with his hands folded in his lap. Thus the Emersons now could gaze at a framed oval daguerreotype on the mantel of Waldo, his expression solemn and far away, his hair parted in the middle with bangs combed sideways into temporary obedience. His sculpted thin lips, so like his mother's, had had to remain grave and still. Like the unrecorded movements of people strolling Paris boulevards, as Daguerre took his early photographs, laughter was invisible to cameras, and even smiles faded while the inhumanly patient shudder waited for enough light to seep in. A person's likeness could be preserved, distilling memories into a sober gray portrait, magically drawn with light. But the fleeting gestures, smiles, raised eyebrows, the sparkle of life, were lost. Thank you. Thank you. My voice did not go all the way to Mickey Mouse at all. F. Clark will tell us if we have to run madly out of here, or so. My favorite part's always Q&A, because I knew roughly what I was going to do. My favorite part so far is Jay's introduction, but I mean second would be Q&A. Yes, sir.
How did your investigation of Henry change your view of what we call disease, autism?
As somebody who has been described by 2 therapists and 3 girlfriends as seriously Asperger's-y, I have paid some attention to this topic already in the past, and one of the very few organizations I follow is the National Autism Society, and I get their newsletters and updates. And I might as well say this because there's nothing you can do to me for being silly. I cried all the way through the movie Temple Grandin because there were aspects of it that seemed to me the way life felt to me that I hadn't seen. And I spend a huge amount of time building up just to being not twitching and tapping and not jumping every time there's the slightest noise and all those things. And so I was very sensitive to that topic. I read the articles about it that different people had written, critiquing it, talking to psychologists, and the general consensus, well, I'm not qualified. I haven't read through it. I'm not doing a paper on it, so I'm not really qualified, but my sense is the general consensus was there was plenty of evidence that he was high-functioning autistic. All of the anecdotal physical descriptions and all of that seems to me to fit in it perfectly. So part of what it did for me, that and watching the movie Temple Grandin, the Clary Danes movie, during this process and reading some Temple Grandin, part of what that did for me was make it all more real and human. And another thing was that I've always felt so pummeled by noise, and by following the Autism Society's updates that I get once a week, I learned that a lot of theaters now, as people become more and more sensitive to this, and of course it's in danger of becoming the fad of the week, or it'll be the Hallmark after-school movie or whatever. But there's so much out there, and calling it a spectrum seems to be so useful. But I learned that movie theaters often have a day, once or twice a month, that's autism-friendly, where they tone down and change the speakers. They take out all the ads. They take out all the jump cuts. They show slow-moving movies. So I just, what that makes me think of, I have to tell you one little thing, is that somebody was talking about the writing process from the outside seems so incredibly boring. And I was thinking about that earlier, and the autism thing made me think of it, that if you have footage, archival footage of George and Ira Gershwin hammering out a tune, you've got something worth watching. But if you have archival footage of Joyce Carol Oates writing a first draft and erasing a lot and doing a second draft, then you're trapped in a Yoko Ono movie. And, and you should probably just cure yourself now. And so that was one of the things we were talking about when discussing autism recently, the different slower pace of such things. Somebody said that if it was the jump cuts that were bothering a lot of the children who came to movies, they recommended a really slow Thai movie that they had seen that took 4 hours. So I just learned a lot about, in reading the tangential and corollary stuff about autism, it just all became more human to me. And has anyone read that wonderful British novel, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime? It's a kind of a work of genius. It's narrated, it's one of the funniest books I've ever read, and it's narrated by an autistic boy. Excuse me. Sorry, that's a big tangent there, but. Yes, hi.
when you were writing the book, did you read Walden over and over and over again? Did you become so close to it? Did you have a part of it that, maybe some study that's your favorite part?
Wow, that's a really good question. I don't know that I can answer it, but it's a good question. Well, I had read it numerous times. It's like The Wind in the Willows. I discovered I have 11, 12 editions already before I started the book. I have 4 annotated editions of Walden, for example. I think the chapter on sounds, there's something about, I'm not a musical person. I can't even remember birdsong. I can't remember tunes. I'm hopeless. But something about reading his obsession with music and his obsession with sound. And he would do always these childish little things, like if his walking stick hit a rock and made a certain noise when he's marching along on a hike, he would back up and try again and again until to recreate that noise. And so those kinds of ways that he was obsessed with sound is something that, because of the way my brain works, I had sort of read right through it, because my brain is so visual. And so I think part of what it opened up for me was his listening to the world, and also his sensitivity to smell. One of the great parts of Walden for me is when and it's even better in the journals that he did it from, and that was the great fun for me, was the journals. It's when he's standing beside the train tracks of the Fitchburg Railway and talking about the train cars and where they're going and where they've been, and they're coming down from Maine, and the logs have just been stripped, and you can still, and they're so fresh, the sap is like they're bleeding. They've just been animals that have just been skinned. And he smells a whiff of coffee, and it becomes this Whitman-esque inventory of the cosmos, smelled as the train went by. And it's kind of a work of genius. I mean, there's a moment right there when I go, okay, that hasn't been done that way before, I don't think. And I hadn't encountered any writer before that moment who did that kind of thing. The same way with Mark Twain's opening of Tom Sawyer. Tom, no answer. Tom, no answer. Where is that boy? Devil take that boy. Who had done that before? I mean, those are the kinds of moments that I just love. And with Henry, it was the scent and his very weird little odes to sound. And I realize his importance as an activist in civil liberties, and I write about that pretty extensively as the part of it that was going on early in his life at this point. But for me, it's always about his imaginative response to nature. The other part is, to me, almost extra. Whereas in India, where Thoreau is considered the greatest American, according to a recent essay I read from there, and Martin Luther King said everything about the civil rights movement came from reading Walden, from reading Civil Disobedience while he was at Morehouse College. So I recognize the global, vast significance. But what I always return to is the weird little simile that came up when he watched how a duck disappeared under the water and the ripples went out. Excuse me. The other side of the team here, yes.
I was thinking about Jason's connection and realizing that I can kind of see how one of your projects led to the next. Like, you have this series of books about some aspect of an activist, and that would definitely lead to a biography of the world that led to Charlotte's Web, which would lead to this. And then I can see your Gaslight Mysteries, how that would ultimately point you to a biography of the early days of Arthur Conan Doyle. But I don't see how those two threads come together. Do you see that?
I think I do. And what she mentioned about Arthur Conan Doyle is my most I signed recently another 2-book deal with Bloomsbury for a book on the early days of Arthur Conan Doyle and the real people in his life who inspired the creation of Sherlock Holmes. And it was one of the rare times in my life when an editor was just jumping up and down. And so part of the deal, by the way, is I write it quickly before this wave crests. And I'm not the most practical person in the world, but I have to pay the bills, so I do a research, and it's like I gave them all the info. Yes, there's a 3rd Robert Downey movie coming. Yes, the Elementary's been renewed. Yes, Sherlock has been renewed. There's a new this and that. There's an Ian McKellen movie in which he plays the retired Sherlock Holmes. The wave is not over. So my idea is bring it out next year. We all make a nice, happy amount of money, and I have a lot of fun writing a book that's not about the American freaking Renaissance. Okay, sorry. So there's my ad for my next book. It is about 19th century sensibility to me somehow. I mean, why? I mean, I have no formal education. I was baptized in a creek. I was raised missionary Baptist in the woods. I don't know why I got interested in all of these things, but the mid to late, especially Victorian imagination, fascinates me. And we've talked about this a little bit in Jay's book, Dickens on the Holodeck, right? Looks into this a lot. I mean, in a lot deeper and more scholarly way than I'm doing here, making a bunch of jokes. But for me, just my personal taste, there's a period in which the structure of society and the attitudes are close enough to us to seem familiar, far enough away to still seem exotic. And there's something, even though for most people it was a bad time to live, people go, wouldn't it be great to be in the Victorian era, you'd have servants? No, we'd be the servants, So no, that wouldn't be good. But there is a point where I see, as it goes right into the Edwardian era, just around the corner is blitzkrieg and mustard gas, and then the Manhattan Project, and there's something mythic about that moment to me, that there's a dragon over here. There's a period in here, and also the people who just fascinate me so much, Dickens, Darwin. So the book after Sherlock is about Darwin for that reason. There's something about the insatiable appetite for the information pouring in. Darwin on the Beagle, Huxley on HMS Rattlesnake. The exploration of the whole world, and the secularization of education, in which, and they were finally, everybody was going, okay, this 6,000 year stuff, that's not going to work, And Charles Lyell was doing the principles of geology, and James Hutton was looking at the age of the earth and catastrophism, and all these wonderful things were coming together. And so here's another convergence, is the next anthology is, after the ghost stories coming out this year in the series, is Victorian science fiction. It's called Frankenstein Dreams. It starts with Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, and it ends with H.G. Wells and The Island of Dr. Moreau, that terrifying evolutionary fable. So, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is in there, and so there's all of the fear of what we're discovering about ourselves and the fear of what we're discovering out there. And so those are coming together to me. And so even with, and then I'll stop, I promise, and just one more thought about this, is that about how do these converge, the Sherlock book. I get annoyed with the later Arthur Conan Doyle for being the evangelist for spiritualism, where he becomes far more gullible than Dr. Watson and not the least bit like Sherlock Holmes. But spiritualism was seen as scientific evidence for an afterlife. And when the young Arthur Conan Doyle, the one I'm writing about, is fanatically science-minded, very early on rejected organized religion. Sherlock Holmes, the point is he's a scientist. He was inspired entirely by the scientists that three in particular, particularly Dr. Joseph Bell at Edinburgh Medical School. And he was a science man. He was a Byronic figure turned into thinker as hero, thinker as swashbuckler. And so to me, there's a big convergence there, and I'm just sort of playing around on that crossroads where so many cool things are happening. And also the writing style, there's a lot of texture in the natural history. And by the way, Bloomsbury foolishly approved that I had to start adding some nonfiction series to the anthology series, so I'm going to do Victorian natural history. Because why not? So I'm sorry I went off on that so much, but I just suddenly was thinking, oh wait, I see more convergences here. Thank you. Or not. The risk being I free associate again. Yes?
Getting back to what you said about this is all before, do you think that in the 1950s there was a kind of a romance and innocence to science?
Absolutely. And in fact, Steve Womack, my dear friend Steve here, said one of the immortal lines that I quote in Darwin's Orchestra without identifying you. It was, and I told you this once, and I think you've forgotten. I was describing to Steve how Darwin, the very young Darwin on the Beagle, he's in the Galapagos, and he wants to learn about the iguanas that have no fear of human beings at all. So part of what he does is he wades out and picks up the iguanas and throws them as far as he can to see if they will just swim back. And I remember reading that to the writers group I was in with Steve, when I was first fooling with Darwin's Orchestra. And there was just a pause at the end, and Steve said, "It was a simpler time." And so I put that, so in Darwin's Orchestra that reads as one commentator observed, "It was a simpler time." So yes, I think that that's very much, there's a passion and an excitement and and this slow, the fire was lit in the Renaissance kind of thing, but it caught fire with Huxley and the working men's lectures and all those kinds of things. It caught fire as, oh my God, the cosmos is comprehensible. It's, we're plumbing the depths of the ocean, and any next thing is Carl Sagan. And then Neil deGrasse Tyson. Oh my God, it's just going to go on forever. And I do think there was that kind of, and natural history was the hobby. The terrariums, the ferns, the everybody going shell collecting. Even if you're wearing a skirt that has 9 layers of underwear under it, you're walking around on the beach like this, and someone has to help you pick up the shells. You're still going to pick them up because everybody's obsessed. And then there are the few beautiful little sparks of smart-ass brain out there going, why the hell is that shell on the top of a mountain anyway? I just love this stuff. And so then I find a corner, I dig, and I do a draft of a section. And then with that in hand and a copy of a previous book so they know I'm not a nut, I get in touch with various experts and say, am I thinking in the right direction with this? And I have enough, though, to show them I'm serious before I do that. So anyway, okay, I'm sorry, that's supposed to be the last thing. Thank you very much.